Nick, thank you very much indeed for chairing this meeting, and thanks to Liberal Reform for this set of Fringe meetings at the conference, all of them interesting and most of them fairly controversial by the look of it. I'd also like on your behalf to thank both Paul and Ben for being here this evening to give us their outside contributions and from a very different perspective, one from the public perspective and one from the tax expert's perspective. And Ben has highlighted how sensitive this issue is politically and also the ambiguity around some of the public's views on it. Paul, I think, has invited us to, as politicians, have a clearer vision of where we should actually be going on tax. And I think he's right that there is a tendency in all of the parties to think rather incrementally, both in terms of the issues that happen to be at the top of the public's list of priorities at any one point in time, and politicians are understandably going to be sensitive to those. And also, during a period of time when there isn't a lot of money to go around to lubricate reform, it's very easy to end up moving particular parts of the tax down without moving to a long-term vision. Frankly, though, I'm going to challenge Paul a little bit to contribute and to help us to move towards a more coherent long-term vision, because I think one of the things that has been missing a little bit over the last decade or so is a more forceful contribution and pressure on politicians to think long-term in relation to tax. And bodies such as the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which are preeminent in their sphere in terms of the economic debate and the tax debate and the spending debate, have at times over the last decade, for justifiable reasons, spent quite a lot scrutinising, for example, what governments are doing in terms of their macroeconomic forecasts. I think I'm right in saying that comparing the green budgets that Paul's organisation has produced every year, pre-budget, to inform the thinking, and comparing them with quite a long time ago, there's been a lot about macroeconomic policy, about borrowing, about what's going to happen to the deficit, more I think than there was a decade or so ago. And that's understandable, because that's been right at the centre of the debate about what governments are doing and whether we're going to have to cut back on spending or raise taxes. And tax has been obviously in there as an issue, but quite often it's been in this more sort of short-term reactive mode rather than sketching out a long-term vision. And I would like to see if I can encourage Paul, under his leadership, and particularly now we have the Office of Budget Responsibility with the fantastic Robert Choke that is to do Paul's job in it. I think therefore giving more credibility to the forecast that the government is using for macroeconomic forecasting. I think that there is a bigger space here for the IFS to move back into in terms of setting out the longer term agendas for tax and encouraging parties to think about that and offering solutions as well, because we don't have all the answers. I would urge Paul, however, when he does that, because there have been some big reports in this area recently, not least the Merlin's review that some of you, if you're experts in tax, will be aware of, that has looked fairly fundamentally at the tax system and invited politicians to move in a particular direction. But I would invite the IFS and others, when they do this, to be realistic not only about the right vision, but about the pathway for getting there. Because quite often, tax experts are very good at telling us where we should be and not how we're going to get there. And I thought it wouldn't be long before Paul touched, for example, on the thorny issue of the ridiculous, VAT system that we have in this country, where some items are VAT exempt and some of them are zero rated and some of them are fully rated. And economists, of course, absolutely hate this. It drives them insane. They want to have one VAT rate. They say the massive, savings to the economy if you didn't get this distortion where people buy this thing because it's zero rated and not that thing that's 20% rated. And so for years and years, they've been desperate to get politicians to put value-added tax on food, on energy, on children's clothing, on all the items that are incredibly politically sensitive and would be very, very unpopular. And I recall getting an early warning in my political career over the sensitivity of tax when I turned up in 1994 to work for Malcolm Bruce, who some of you will remember was then the party's Treasury spokesman, and various documents were coming into Malcolm's office and we'd sort of run out of space to put them. So he told me to find some room in one of the filing cabinets, clear it out, put these things in, get rid of some stuff. And I opened the top filing cabinet, and in there were some letters from a campaign when the then Tory government was considering putting VAT on newspapers and books. And I found the first bit of file and I thought perhaps I'll get rid of these. And then I went further and further back in the filing cabinet, more and more of these letters, and it turned out that one entire filing cabinet from top to bottom was full of letters from the public, inspired, I think, by certain newspapers as well, saying how outrageous it would be if VAT was put on newspapers and books. And Malcolm said that he'd spent a whole month signing letters back to people saying that this would be outrageous and we'd never do it. So you have to have a vision on tax, but you also have to have a pathway in some of these critical areas that Paul's mentioned to actually get there. A sensitive issue for politicians, and one that I wouldn't normally be commenting upon, given it's not my area of responsibility, were it not for the fact that we have a tax review as a party that we've got to develop a new tax policy on over the next year. But I will always be aware of the sensitivity of tax. Thinking back to my rather brief time at the Treasury in May 2010, when I was told very early on that one of the senior civil servants would come around to brief me on tax policy and what I should say and everything, because I was supposed to be focusing on spending, but no doubt tax would come up. And he came in to my office in the Treasury, and I was there with a great pad ready to write down all sorts of notes on what I should say and shouldn't say. And he said, "Minister, there's only one thing you need to remember on tax. If anyone asks you a question about it, you just say, tax is a matter for the Chancellor of the Exchequer." That probably is rather good advice, but it can't be a matter just for the Chancellor of the Exchequer when actually we have a tax review in the party. So without saying anything too exciting that will cause Danny to phone me up late tonight, I just wanted to talk very briefly about what principles need to lie behind a Lib Dem tax system, and then we'll open it up to either Stephen if he arrives or to a proper debate. The first thing for me is simplicity, because as Paul indicated earlier on, the problem with tax systems is that they start off with some principles, but then over time all sorts of bits are tacked onto them to suit particular political purposes. And usually the Treasury at the time will argue that there is some sort of economic rationale for each particular development of the tax system. But it makes the tax system more and more complicated, it makes compliance with taxes more and more complicated, and of course complexity makes it very much easier to avoid taxes, or for some of the taxes that are introduced to have very unusual and bizarre effects compared with what was expected when they were first introduced. And I always remember the classic example of this was Gordon Brown, who could not let any budget or autumn statement, pre-budget reports as they were then called, pass without tinkering with some tax. And back in the period, in the early 2000s, Paul will probably remember exactly when, he introduced this tiny tax relief called the film industry's tax relief, which was designed to try to attract to this country, the odd exotic British film, either with Hugh Grant or with nice sort of pictures of Britain and castles and everything. And this was supposed to cost, I think, £10 million per year or something, and create a renaissance in the British film industry. Well, within about 3 years, the tax accountants had run rings around this thing. And what was supposed to be incentivising a few British films that might otherwise have been made abroad had actually caused a whole series of programmes on television, I think Doctor Who, EastEnders and all sorts of things, to be redesignated as films. And therefore this tax relief that was supposed to be incentivising 1 or 2 films to be made in this country and costing £10 million had suddenly become costing, I think it was something like 200 or 250 million pounds, £500. We're outbidding each other here. But it had become extraordinarily expensive and massive deadweight cost associated with it. And of course, what then happened was the whole thing had to be scaled back, and all the accountants who'd rolled it out had to roll it back. And there've been worse examples. I mean, governments, I think under Gordon Brown as well, changes in some of the corporation tax regimes that for small companies that created incentives for incorporation, I can't remember, and they all did it overnight, and then it was such a huge loss of revenue, it was all undone the next year. So really trying to keep things simple in order to have some principles behind the tax system, avoid wasting vast amounts of revenue in avoidance, and not having massive compliance. At the same time as you want a simple tax system, you also do want to be clear about what incentives you are going to send out. And generally speaking, you want to send incentives that don't cut against people being in employment, and that's one of the reasons why we're trying to raise the threshold, the starting point for tax, so that the incentives are strengthened for people going into employment and for people on low pay. We as a party obviously have been very passionate about trying to strengthen environmental incentives within the tax system to get people doing the right things. But in terms of sending out those incentive messages, governments and treasuries have to be very clear about what they are trying to do and whether they're likely to work. And many chancellors have introduced things either designed as incentives or presented as incentives, which actually have been just very good ways of raising revenue. And quite often those items of expenditure where we're trying to change people's behaviour, be it smoking or driving a car, turn out to be areas where people's behaviour runs on whatever happens on tax, and therefore the Exchequer ends up benefiting by getting a huge yield in without there being a fundamental change in behaviour. So we have to be very careful when we're introducing these incentive mechanisms about what we're trying to achieve and whether or not it's likely to work. And then there's the last category, before we open this up, there's the kind of fairness category. Funnily enough, our tax system, which people often argue that we ought to have a much simpler sort of flat tax system. But one of the funny things about our tax system is when you actually step back and look at the effect of all of the different taxes combining, what you find is that you've got something already that by accident looks fairly much like a flat tax system. The interaction of all of the indirect taxes, of regressive taxes like the council tax, with income tax thresholds, with the allowances, actually means that the proportion of income that people pay in tax is pretty similar across the whole of the income distribution, with some strange figures for the bottom 10%, which don't necessarily mean what they appear to mean, given that people float in and out of that band and don't always have the characteristics that you think they do by simply looking at where they are in the income distribution. But obviously part of our strategy is to give incentives for people on low incomes to be in employment, and also to lighten the tax burden on those people who have least ability to pay. And that's why we have championed a higher tax threshold. That's why Danny Alexander, I think, at our last conference indicated that he wants to go beyond the 10,000 allowance and at some stage move it up to a level much closer to the minimum wage. Fairness also for those people on high incomes. And I don't think fairness for people on high income always means just simply having higher marginal tax rates. I mean, at some point, and economists argue tremendously about where that is, you're going to incentivise people to relocate or to avoid tax if the marginal tax rates are very high. And actually, as a liberal, I've never liked the idea of taking as much as or more than a half of people's marginal incomes in taxation. I think it's a test for a liberal to get a tax system that's both fair, that makes sure that people on upper incomes are making a decent contribution, but without the state being given power to take away people's incomes beyond what many of us would think of as a reasonable threshold level. My view, however, about the way in which you get fairness for upper incomes is you make sure that you remove from the system the massive opportunities there are for tax avoidance. And actually the way to make the tax system fairer for everybody in society and to ensure that there is a proper contribution from those at the top of the income distribution is to take away both the opportunities to easily avoid tax and also many of those tax reliefs which are designed in ways that specifically give very large amounts of relief to a minority of the population, usually the top 10 or 20%. And I think, there was a debate last year when Nick championed this idea of there being a minimum amount of tax that everybody should be paying, that people shouldn't be able to abuse their allowances, and there was the controversy over the charities issue. But actually it seems to me that the principle that people on very high incomes should be paying a minimum amount of their income in taxation is a very good one. And of course it's a very live issue in the United States of America in the presidential election. So I think fairness in relation to people at the top end of the income distribution, but not necessarily by having ever higher marginal tax rates, but reducing the opportunities for avoidance and making sure that tax release and allowances are not giving an excessive benefit to people who already are on very high incomes. And the very last point, a tricky one in terms of developing policy, but one of the challenges I think for us when we think about the tax review that's ongoing at the moment is the issue of intergenerational fairness. There is this big concern that there is a generation now of people retiring who've actually got pretty good pensions, who have benefited from the massive increase in house prices across the population. And there is a feeling that the younger generation, and David Willett's recently published a book on this about intergenerational fairness, that the younger generation may be losing out, that the terms of trade for them in terms of the levels of tax, the charges of course for tuition, the way in which the pension systems are changing, the demise of many salary-related pensions is actually giving young people a worse deal than the cohort of people retiring at the moment. And of course, when you look at the tax system for young people, or the deductions that are made to your income as a young person when you're leaving education, it's not just about the income tax rate, and it's not just about the contribution that you're going to pay on your university tuition if you've gone to university. It's also, of course, that there is a national insurance contribution rate to pay. It's also that you're going to have to pay a pension contribution into usually a defined contribution scheme. And then you've got the massive costs, the mortgage costs that are associated with funding a mortgage in an environment where house prices are very, very high. Now, I don't know whether we can deal with that last one through the tax system, because there are some complications of designing into a tax system an ability to be fairer across the generations. But I think that is one of the challenges that we have in the tax review, which we're now embarked upon, and which will report back to this conference, I believe, in a year's time. Is that right, Jeremy? Nick, that I think is a bit of an overview without hopefully saying anything that will be too exciting for members of the press who are attending. I guess we will be joined at some stage by Stephen, but maybe in the meantime you just want to open it up for...
Yes.